The morning of Thanksgiving in 1982 dawned with a brittle chill, the kind that makes the breath curl like smoke in the pale sunlight. In the small town, a faint mist clung to the streets, the kind that muffled the usual clatter of early risers and the occasional hum of passing cars. In a modest house on the corner of Maple and Cedar, the family stirred to the familiar rhythms of the holiday. The father, a man of quiet routines, moved through the kitchen, carefully arranging the coffee cups, the clink of porcelain a small comfort against the rising anticipation of the day. The mother, radiant with the subtle energy of preparation, carried the scent of baked bread and pumpkin spice, humming a tune her children had long since memorized. Their children, 2 boys and a girl, flitted through the rooms, their voices overlapping in the warm chaos of excitement, the small arguments about who would carve the turkey, who would set the table, trivial disputes that, in retrospect, would echo with the weight of a life forever paused. Outside, the town seemed to move in slow motion, unaware of the invisible thread of unease that would soon unravel everything. Neighbors greeted one another with practiced cheer, children tugged at their parents' hands as they rushed to see snowflakes, and the crisp air carried the faint tang of wood smoke. In the house, laughter spilled over breakfast plates, the mundane details of buttered toast, steaming coffee, and the flicker of morning sunlight through the curtains grounding them in an ordinary, almost comforting reality. The children ran to the window to watch the first flakes drift lazily to the ground, little knowing that this ordinary moment would become the last image of a life so vividly lived. By mid-morning, small details began to hint at the impending disruption. The father stepped out to check the mailbox, returning with nothing but the echo of his own footsteps, the crisp paper of the local newsletter flapping silently in his hand. The mother called for the children, her voice cutting through the air, but there was only the soft rustle of the house and the hum of the refrigerator. It was the kind of quiet that seemed normal at first, the kind that could be mistaken for a momentary lapse in attention. But as the hours wore on, the ordinary rhythms faltered. Calls to the neighbors went unanswered, doors left ajar swung gently in the breeze, and the turkey, once the centerpiece of warmth and familial comfort, sat untouched, its aroma gradually fading into the cold, empty air. Evening arrived with a subtle, creeping unease. The once vibrant home seemed frozen, the windows catching the dimming light like glassy eyes staring outward, as if the house itself held its breath. A neighbor, drawn by an instinctive sense that something was amiss, knocked lightly on the door, then louder, but the only response was silence. The children's laughter, the mother's gentle admonitions, the father's calm reassurance, all vanished into the chill that had settled over the house. By nightfall, the local authorities were alerted, neighbors gathered with cautious curiosity, and a pervasive dread spread quietly through the streets. The once familiar place now carried an unfamiliar weight, each shadow elongated, each corner a silent witness to absence. In that first night, uncertainty became a living presence. The community, though close-knit, felt the first tremors of fear ripple through their routines. The small town, accustomed to ordinary mishaps and petty disputes, suddenly confronted a void it had never known. The absence of the family transformed the air itself. The usual clatter of late-night footsteps, the soft murmur of conversation from windows left open, the hum of a neighbor's radio, all became stark reminders of what was missing. It was not only the physical absence that struck the heart, but the invisible threads of daily life abruptly severed. The empty chairs at the kitchen table, the cold bed still bearing the imprint of small bodies, and the faint, lingering scent of a breakfast never fully eaten. As the first night gave way to the creeping uncertainty of dawn, the community's worry solidified into something heavier, grief born prematurely, a sense of loss without context, and the first whispers of questions that would linger for decades. Who had seen them last? Where could they have gone? Why had they vanished without a trace? In those hours, the ordinary warmth of a Thanksgiving morning became an enduring ache, the first brush of a mystery that would span generations, setting the stage for a story of love, absence, and haunting silence that would refuse to be forgotten. The first hours after the family's disappearance were filled with a strange mixture of disbelief and urgency. Neighbors, initially hoping it was a simple oversight, began to notice details that gnawed at the edges of reason. The front door, usually secured with a familiar click, stood slightly ajar. The family's car remained parked in its usual spot, tires cold, windshield dotted with the morning frost. Inside, plates of untouched food sat on the table, the sweet aroma of pumpkin pie still faint in the air, as if the household itself had paused mid-breath. It was a scene frozen in time, ordinary and domestic, yet laden with a silent horror that no one could name. Authorities arrived quickly, yet even their presence could not quell the rising tension. Officers moved methodically through the rooms, gloves rustling against the surfaces of counters and shelves, their trained eyes scanning for signs, for footprints, for anything that might suggest where the family had gone. The living room remained undisturbed, the television still flickering softly, a forgotten program frozen on its last frame. The investigators' notebooks filled with details, the scratching of pens almost audible in the unnatural quiet, yet every clue only deepened the mystery. Neighbors offered accounts, fragmentary and contradictory. The children had been seen playing outside that morning, the mother hanging a dishcloth by the sink, the father tending to the mailbox. Each recollection carried an air of reliability, yet none could explain the sudden and complete absence that now gripped the house. Outside, the town had begun to gather, drawn by a combination of concern and the strange magnetism of the unknown. Faces pressed against frosty windows, whispered conversations tracing through the streets, and the faint stirrings of fear seeped into every corner. In homes down the block, parents held their children a little closer, friends muttered to one another in hushed tones, and the usual rhythms of the day faltered under the weight of unease. Every passing moment magnified the absence, transforming it into a presence of its own, a shadow that hovered over the town, tangible and relentless. Search parties were organized, volunteers moving through the surrounding woods and fields, their breath visible in the crisp air, footsteps crunching through frost-laden grass. Flashlights cut through the growing gloom, sweeping over fences and tree trunks, eyes straining to find a hint of the missing family. Each discovery, or lack thereof, sent waves of hope and despair. A dropped mitten, a footprint in the mud, the glint of something metallic half buried in leaves. Each sign suggested a story, a possibility, yet ultimately led nowhere. The ordinary landscape of the town became uncanny, familiar yet charged with foreboding. Within the home, the atmosphere was almost unbearable. The rooms were silent but for the soft ticking of a wall clock, each tick emphasizing the absence, each chime a reminder of the family who had once filled the space with laughter and conversation. The investigators noted the small details, a chair slightly out of place, a teacup that had dried into a fragile crust, a child's toy still resting on the floor as if abandoned mid-play. These minute observations became emotional signposts, connecting the audience to the intimate life of a family now suspended in uncertainty. It was in these details that the tragedy began to take shape, not through spectacle, but through the delicate rendering of ordinary life interrupted. Even as professional searches continued, the emotional landscape grew more complicated. Friends and relatives arrived, their faces etched with confusion, disbelief, and growing dread. They retraced the family's steps, called out names into the thinning light, and revisited the spaces where the family's routines had once unfolded. Each attempt at normalcy collided with the harshness of the reality they now faced. Phones rang unanswered, doors remained locked, and the faint smell of cooking lingered like a ghost. The emotional tension in these hours was as sharp as any physical danger, a quiet, pervasive anxiety that settled over every attempt to find answers. As night fell, the search shifted from daylight exploration to methodical investigation. The town was enveloped in a cold, quiet darkness, only broken by flashlights moving through fields or the glow of headlights parked near the house. The ordinary night sounds, crickets, wind rustling through trees, the distant bark of a dog, felt amplified against the unnatural stillness. Investigators catalogued every possibility, neighbors speculated in whispers, and the first theories began to form, hesitant and fragmented. Could it have been a runaway? An accident? Something more sinister? Each theory carried its own weight of fear, none fully satisfying, all deepening the sense of unease. By the end of that first day, what was ordinary had become alien. The house, once warm and full of life, seemed to hold its breath. Outside, the town had been drawn into a collective uncertainty, its residents caught between hope and dread. The absence of the family, so complete and inexplicable, began to take on a life of its own, haunting every corner of the familiar streets and every flicker of the dimming day. In the quiet, amidst the flashlights and whispered questions, a narrative of mystery, tension, and sorrow began to crystallize, a story that would ripple outward, touching every life connected to the missing family, and eventually, for decades to come, refusing to be forgotten. As the initial shock of the family's disappearance settled, the town began to experience a subtle shift, one that no one could have anticipated. At first, life continued in its usual cadence, as if the ordinary routines of grocery shopping, school, and work could somehow shield residents from the creeping unease. But behind closed doors and in hushed whispers at local diners, the absence of the family became an unspoken presence, a shadow hovering over conversations and casual greetings. Neighbors, once comfortable in their familiar connections, began to glance more often at windows, to linger over doors left slightly ajar, to watch the streets with a wary curiosity that bordered on suspicion. The town, tight-knit and self-contained, had always prided itself on community and trust, but now those bonds began to fray. Rumors began to swirl, as they always do in places where everyone knows everyone. Some whispered that the family had left of their own accord, fleeing some hidden shame or debt, though no evidence supported such claims. Others suggested darker possibilities: foul play, an accident covered up, secrets buried beneath the surface of an otherwise ordinary town. The tone of conversation shifted from casual gossip to speculation tinged with fear. Everyday encounters, neighbors exchanging pleasantries over fences or in grocery aisles, now carried an undercurrent of wariness, each polite smile shadowed by questions that dared not be asked aloud. The emotional strain was palpable. Friends of the missing family oscillated between hope and despair, each passing day stretching the boundaries of patience and belief. Those who had been closest to the family replayed their last interactions over and over, searching for overlooked clues, a lingering glance, an unusual remark, a hesitation in tone. In the quiet moments of early mornings or late nights, they imagined the family somewhere just beyond reach, alive but unable to return. This yearning, combined with creeping suspicion, created a volatile emotional mix, one that rippled through the town with subtle yet persistent intensity. Even the town's children were not immune. Kids whispered questions to each other in playgrounds and schoolyards, their voices low, hushed with the weight of things they did not fully understand. They speculated about monsters or accidents, about mysterious strangers and secret disappearances, yet beneath their fear lay a nascent awareness of absence, the eerie gap left in a world that once felt safe and predictable. Adults often dismissed these conversations, but even they could not entirely escape the sense that something fundamental had shifted, that the rhythm of their small lives had been irrevocably altered. Community gatherings, church services, Thanksgiving dinners, town meetings, became charged with tension. Eyes darted toward empty chairs, the absence of familiar faces a silent testament to the mystery that gripped everyone. Even casual interactions in cafes or at the post office carried a subtle weight, as if the collective consciousness of the town had been shaped by one unspoken question: what had happened to the family? This pervasive anxiety created a dichotomy between the outward calm of ordinary life and the inner turmoil of fear and suspicion. People smiled, nodded, and exchanged polite words, but beneath the surface, their minds churned with conjecture and doubt. As weeks turned into months, the sense of unease hardened into suspicion. Neighbors began scrutinizing each other, tracing movements, recalling minor oddities they had once overlooked. Why had the Johnsons, who lived 2 streets over, been unusually quiet that day? Why did the mail carrier remember seeing the father speaking with someone unfamiliar the morning of Thanksgiving? Every memory became a potential clue, every overlooked detail a thread to be pulled. The town became both observer and participant in the unfolding mystery, a collective consciousness searching for answers while wrestling with its own fears. Emotionally, this period was draining, a slow erosion of certainty and trust. Friends of the family struggled with guilt and helplessness, questioning whether they could have done more, noticed earlier, intervened in some way. Local authorities, constrained by limited evidence, were viewed with a mixture of respect, frustration, and skepticism. Every unanswered question amplified the tension, turning ordinary interactions into charged encounters. People began to isolate themselves, wary of judgment or blame, while others clung desperately to community, hoping shared effort might unravel the mystery. The contrast between the town's surface and the underlying tension became stark. Daytime routines, school, work, errands, continued with mechanical precision, but evenings were haunted by silent speculation. Lights stayed on longer, doors were locked earlier, and conversations carried an undercurrent of fear and uncertainty. Small acts of vigilance, a neighbor glancing toward the house on the corner, a parent walking their child past the fields that bordered the town, became ritualized attempts to maintain control over a world that now felt unpredictable. By the end of this period, the town had transformed. What was once familiar had become foreign. The family's absence had left more than just empty rooms and abandoned routines, it had cracked the psychological landscape of the community itself. Suspicion, grief, hope, and fear coexisted uneasily, a persistent tension that refused to dissipate. The ordinary became strange, the mundane haunted by possibility, and the small town, once anchored by trust and familiarity, now existed in a liminal space, suspended between knowing and not knowing. This period of fractured certainty set the stage for everything that would follow. The town's psyche, strained by months of unanswered questions and whispered rumors, became fertile ground for the mysteries yet to emerge. The community's emotional journey, from disbelief to suspicion, from hope to tentative despair, mirrored the narrative itself, a slow burn unfolding, a tapestry of ordinary lives caught in the grip of extraordinary absence, and a haunting reminder that the ripple effects of disappearance reach far beyond the missing themselves. Months turned into a painstaking rhythm of searches, leads, and dead ends, each one carving its own small wound into the hearts of the family's loved ones. The police maintained a steady presence, combing through the town and surrounding countryside with meticulous care. Officers retraced every known route the family had taken, revisiting their routines, habits, and even the smallest idiosyncrasies that might offer a clue. In the quiet of the investigation rooms, maps and photographs littered tables, evidence boards marked with strings connecting names and dates, yet despite the precision of these efforts, each lead seemed to vanish like smoke. Every faint hope, every promising tip, ultimately dissipated, leaving behind a lingering frustration that gnawed at both authorities and family members alike. The investigation became a meticulous study of absence. Officers examined the house repeatedly, noting items that remained untouched: a child's favorite toy, a well-worn coat hanging in the closet, the faint imprint of a breakfast still half-eaten. Forensic teams swept for fingerprints, dusted for traces, and examined the edges of the home and yard, but the results were often inconclusive. Outside, neighbors were questioned again and again, recounting sightings, snippets of conversation, or the unusual silence they had noticed on that fateful Thanksgiving day. Yet even the most detailed memories offered only fragments, disconnected pieces that failed to form a coherent picture. Each attempt to assemble these pieces heightened the tension, the unknown stretching the days into a liminal space between hope and despair. The emotional toll on the family's relatives was profound. Siblings, cousins, and friends clung desperately to small signs, replaying every phone call, every visit, every gesture for any hidden message or overlooked hint. The parents' absence became an unrelenting weight, pressing into holidays, birthdays, and mundane daily routines. Sleep was punctuated by recurring dreams of doors left open, of distant voices calling in empty rooms, of familiar laughter frozen mid-note. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, each day reinforcing the cruel uncertainty of the family's fate. Yet even as grief deepened, hope remained, a fragile thread that refused to break, tying loved ones to the possibility that the family might still be found, alive and whole. Meanwhile, the town's atmosphere reflected the fractured leads and unanswered questions. Conversations at cafes and grocery stores often returned to the disappearance, the topic as inescapable as the air itself. Residents debated theories with intensity, piecing together small inconsistencies into imagined narratives. A neighbor remembered a car parked unusually, another recalled seeing an unfamiliar figure at the edge of the woods, yet these observations only tangled the threads further. Each minor clue became a battleground of interpretation, a contest between reason and fear, between hope and skepticism. Suspicion became a quiet companion in every interaction, an invisible veil through which the town now viewed its own history. Media attention began to filter in, bringing outside eyes to the quiet town. Local reporters pored over case files, and newspapers ran stories that alternately offered empathy and sensationalism. For the family's relatives, these accounts were both balm and burden. The possibility that someone, somewhere, might discover the truth was a glimmer of hope, but every misrepresentation or exaggeration deepened the pain. Friends and neighbors were thrust into an uncomfortable limelight, their memories dissected, their private grief turned into public speculation. The ordinary rhythms of small-town life collided with the demands of public scrutiny, magnifying the emotional intensity of a situation that had already become nearly unbearable. Amid the dead ends, small anomalies began to surface, subtle enough to be easily dismissed, yet persistent enough to demand attention. Letters arrived from unknown senders, the handwriting careful and deliberate but the contents cryptic. A toy found near the edge of a frozen creek sparked frantic investigation, only to reveal itself as unrelated. Each discovery, no matter how minor, carried the emotional weight of potential revelation. Investigators and family members alike experienced brief surges of hope, followed almost inevitably by the return to uncertainty. It was a psychological whiplash that frayed nerves and sharpened obsessions, embedding the case deeper into the collective consciousness of everyone involved. The pattern of fractured leads began to take a toll on the investigators themselves. Experienced officers, used to routine cases and predictable patterns, found themselves confronting a mystery that defied expectation. Late nights were spent cross-referencing witness statements, combing through records, and revisiting sites already examined. The relentless search for connections, between the family's movements, local reports, and the sporadic tips that arrived from outside the town, became a consuming task. And yet, despite all efforts, the case refused to yield its secrets. The investigators' frustration mirrored the anguish of the family's loved ones, a shared sense of helplessness that pervaded every effort. Emotionally, the narrative of these months was one of tension and exhaustion, punctuated by fleeting glimpses of hope. Small signs, an out-of-place object, a recalled conversation, a tip from a distant witness, sparked surges of optimism, only to dissolve under scrutiny. This contrast between hope and disappointment shaped the emotional texture of the investigation, creating a slow, almost unbearable rhythm of anticipation and loss. The town's collective psyche, already strained by the initial shock, became a reflection of these emotional oscillations, a mixture of fear, suspicion, and the stubborn persistence of hope. Even as time passed, the sense of mystery deepened. What had happened to the family remained tantalizingly out of reach, the absence becoming a defining feature of life in the town. The investigation, while exhaustive, revealed more about the emotional landscape of the community than about the family itself, the way people cope with uncertainty, the fragility of trust, and the human tendency to seek patterns even in chaos. The missing family became both a concrete puzzle and a mirror reflecting the town's own vulnerabilities, its anxieties, and its capacity for empathy and obsession alike. Through all these months, one truth became clear: the disappearance was no ordinary case. It was a story not merely of missing people, but of a community transformed by absence, of grief magnified by mystery, of hope tempered by despair. And within this intricate web of leads, missteps, and elusive clues, the stage was set for a discovery that would, decades later, cast a new light on everything the town had endured, forcing a confrontation with a truth that had long been buried in silence. The years that followed the family's disappearance unfolded like a slow, relentless tide, reshaping the town, its people, and the lives of those left behind. Each passing year deepened the shadow that had first fallen over that modest house on Maple and Cedar, transforming it from an immediate shock into a lingering, unrelenting ache. Holidays came and went with an unusual emptiness. Thanksgiving tables had extra chairs set in vain, birthday cakes bore the weight of absent smiles, and the routines of family life carried an invisible void that no one could quite explain. The town moved on, outwardly maintaining the rhythms of ordinary existence, yet beneath the surface, every street, every familiar face, carried the quiet weight of grief, speculation, and unresolved questions. The passage of decades did not dull the pain, it sharpened it in new ways. Friends and relatives clung to memories as fragile as the frost that dusted the town in winter, each recollection imbued with longing and uncertainty. The children of the missing family, now grown, carried invisible scars, ghosts of the lives they had once known, their formative years shadowed by a sense of incompletion. Birthdays, graduations, and life milestones were marred by the absence, the silent knowledge that the family who should have been there was gone. Friends who had once laughed alongside them now spoke in hushed tones, their words cautious, afraid of stirring old wounds. Even the most mundane interactions, grocery runs, casual conversations, reminded them of the gap that could never be filled. For the town as a whole, the disappearance became a historical scar, a story retold at gatherings with a mixture of curiosity, dread, and reverence. New residents learned of the family through whispered anecdotes, and longtime locals carried the memory like a weighty secret, careful to preserve the details of a day that had forever changed their collective consciousness. The mystery became a lens through which ordinary life was filtered. Children warned each other of stranger danger in ways that felt disproportionate, neighbors eyed the woods and fields with subtle suspicion, and casual encounters were tinged with the awareness that sometimes, the ordinary world concealed inexplicable absences. The town's identity itself had been reshaped, defined as much by what it had lost as by what remained. Grief evolved into ritualized remembrance. Friends and relatives found themselves creating small, private ceremonies, visiting the house to leave flowers, setting a place at the table during holidays, or lighting candles in quiet moments of reflection. These acts were at once intimate and haunting, tethering the living to memories of those who had vanished. The mundane details of life, the creak of a floorboard, the faint smell of pie baking, the distant murmur of children playing, became echoes of a past that refused to fully leave, reminders that absence is not simply emptiness, but a persistent presence that shapes thought, emotion, and memory. The lack of resolution fostered a culture of speculation. Books, articles, and later digital forums dissected the case, each theorist adding layers of narrative to the town's story. While some narratives were grounded in fact, others drifted into conjecture, embellishment, and outright fabrication, reflecting the human need to impose order on chaos. Even decades later, the search for truth persisted, whether through amateur sleuths, investigative journalists, or family members who refused to relinquish hope. The story of the missing family became both a personal journey and a public narrative, a tension between memory and myth, between the desire for closure and the impossibility of certainty. Time also revealed the subtle ways absence changes behavior. Neighbors who had once been close drifted apart, unable to reconcile daily life with the weight of an unanswered tragedy. Some became hypervigilant, their movements and routines altered by the fear of sudden disappearance. Others withdrew into quiet introspection, haunted by the thought that they might have noticed something they did not, said something they should not have, or failed to act in a moment that seemed insignificant at the time. Even those who had been tangentially connected to the family experienced the ripple effects of the mystery, an invisible force shaping relationships, behaviors, and emotional landscapes across the town. Yet within this decades-long silence, there remained threads of resilience. Friends and relatives forged new bonds, drawing strength from shared memory and collective effort. They participated in community life while simultaneously honoring the absence, navigating a delicate balance between grief and perseverance. This period of endurance, quiet, slow, and emotionally complex, shaped the narrative in ways that were invisible yet profound, transforming the missing family from simply people who had vanished into enduring symbols of memory, longing, and the human capacity to endure uncertainty. Even as technology and investigative methods advanced over the years, the case resisted resolution. Letters were sent, old tips revisited, and forensic techniques applied retroactively, yet each attempt reinforced the enduring mystery rather than resolving it. The family's absence had become a constant undercurrent, a ghostly presence threading through every attempt at clarity. This ongoing struggle underscored a deeper truth. The emotional weight of a disappearance is not solely tied to the chance of discovery but to the way absence infiltrates memory, shapes relationships, and alters the passage of time. The narrative of these years is as much about the living as it is about the missing. It is a story of resilience tempered by grief, of communities and individuals who carry memory as both burden and talisman, and of the way that unresolved absence permeates daily life. It is the quiet ache of holidays observed in half-light, the haunting pull of places once filled with laughter, and the enduring question that refuses to fade: what happened, and why? By the end of this long period of silence, the stage was set for a revelation that would not only illuminate the fate of the family but also confront the emotional truths that had accumulated over decades. The town, the relatives, and the investigators were all suspended in a delicate balance between hope and resignation, their collective psyche marked indelibly by the absence. And in this space of decades-long uncertainty, the eventual discovery, hidden beneath layers of snow, in a mailbox that had gone unnoticed, would arrive as both shock and catharsis, bridging the years of silence with a truth long buried but impossible to ignore. Winter came quietly, the town wrapped in the stillness of snow that blanketed streets, rooftops, and fields. The landscape, once familiar, was transformed into a muted, almost surreal world, where every footprint and shadow stood out in sharp relief against the soft whiteness. In the midst of this silent expanse, a single mailbox sat half-buried beneath layers of snow, its hinge creaking faintly in the cold wind, as if groaning under the weight of decades-long secrets. For years, no one had paid it much attention. It was an ordinary mailbox, at the edge of a quiet road, marking the threshold of ordinary lives. And yet, in this snow-laden landscape, it would become the catalyst for revelations that had been waiting for more than 40 years. It was a neighbor who first noticed it, a local resident accustomed to routine walks through the frost-covered streets. The mailbox, almost invisible beneath the snow, had something unusual about it. Perhaps it was the slight tilt, the way the snow had shifted strangely against its frame, or the subtle glint of metal beneath the white. Intrigued and somewhat unsettled, the neighbor bent to inspect it, brushing snow away with gloved hands. The metal was colder than expected, and as the door creaked open, a hidden cache of objects was revealed, long concealed from the world, silently waiting to speak. Inside lay evidence, tangible and haunting, that bridged the gap between past and present. Letters yellowed with age, photographs curling at the edges, and personal items of the family, tokens of a life abruptly interrupted, were tucked carefully, almost reverently, as if someone had intended them to be found only when the world was ready. The items were mundane, yet charged with the emotional weight of decades. A child's drawing, a mother's recipe card, a father's wallet, each object whispered stories of ordinary life, frozen in time, yet pregnant with hints of what had transpired. For the first time in more than 40 years, the mystery had a concrete point of contact with reality, a bridge between memory and evidence. The discovery rippled immediately through the town. News traveled fast, carried through hurried phone calls, neighbors knocking on doors, and the cautious curiosity of those who had long lived under the shadow of unanswered questions. Investigators, long accustomed to dead ends, were summoned once more, their methodical approach colliding with the raw emotional energy of the moment. They approached the mailbox as both a physical object and a symbol, a threshold to understanding, a repository of the past, and a promise that the silence of decades might finally be broken. The air itself seemed to shift, charged with anticipation and unease, as if the snow-laden streets held their collective breath. Opening the mailbox became a ritual of revelation. Each letter and photograph was examined with painstaking care. The handwriting, once so familiar, revealed emotions and intentions that had been lost to time. Photographs captured smiles that no one would see again, frozen moments that now carried the weight of haunting nostalgia. Small items, jewelry, trinkets, toys, offered clues not through spectacle but through intimacy, grounding the story in human experience. Every object, every detail, demanded reflection and interpretation, inviting the investigators, the family, and the town to engage not only with evidence but with memory, imagination, and empathy. Emotionally, the impact was immediate and profound. Relatives, some now elderly, were summoned to witness the items, their reactions a mixture of disbelief, grief, and bittersweet recognition. Tears came unbidden, as memories long suppressed surged forward with startling clarity. Friends and neighbors, too, felt the pull of the past, their own recollections refracted through the lens of the newly discovered objects. The mailbox, once ordinary and overlooked, had transformed into a conduit for human emotion, bridging decades of silence with a sudden, almost violent clarity. The discovery also sparked practical action. Investigators began cataloging the contents meticulously, photographing each item, tracing its origins, and connecting it to known timelines and narratives. Letters were read and cross-referenced, photographs were analyzed for context and date, even seemingly trivial objects were scrutinized for hidden significance. What had been lost to memory and rumor was now tangible, each artifact a piece of the puzzle that might finally illuminate the fate of the missing family. The investigative process, once stalled, gained momentum, fueled by the clarity provided by this small, snow-covered vessel of truth. But alongside the exhilaration of discovery was the gnawing ache of what had been lost in the decades of waiting. Each letter and photograph carried reminders of what might have been, missed milestones, birthdays uncelebrated, ordinary life interrupted forever. The mailbox did not merely reveal the family's story, it forced the town and relatives to confront the emotional consequences of absence, the long arc of grief, and the poignancy of finally seeing the past reflected in objects long hidden. The emotional contrast, hope mingled with sorrow, revelation paired with lingering mystery, created a tension that would define the next phase of investigation and understanding. In the quiet aftermath, as snow continued to fall softly over the town, the mailbox stood as a silent sentinel. It had waited through decades of silence, indifferent to the anxieties and heartbreak of those who sought answers. Yet now it offered not only evidence but a profound reminder of the persistence of memory, the weight of human absence, and the inevitability of truth finding its way into the world, even after 42 years. For the town, the relatives, and the investigators, the discovery marked a turning point, a pivot from endless speculation to the tangible possibility of closure, even if the truths revealed would carry a haunting, irrevocable weight. The mailbox had yielded its long-hidden contents, and with them, a fragile window into the family's life and final days. Each item offered a whisper of a story, a fragment of ordinary existence frozen in time, yet laden with meaning that now demanded careful attention. Photographs, yellowed and curling at the edges, captured fleeting smiles and casual poses, scenes of birthday parties, family vacations, and ordinary moments of domestic warmth. Each image seemed to hum with life that was no longer present, a stark contrast to the frozen, silent streets outside. The photographs were more than evidence, they were reminders of intimacy, of a rhythm of life violently interrupted, and of the human connections that endured even in absence. Letters were perhaps the most haunting of all. The careful loops of handwriting betrayed subtle emotions, private thoughts that had remained hidden for decades. Some letters were mundane, a grocery list, a note about appointments, a reminder to pick up milk, yet these small details now bore immense emotional weight. Others hinted at unease, fleeting references to minor disputes, worries about finances, or mentions of unusual encounters in the town. None provided direct explanation of the disappearance, but together they sketched a portrait of a family grounded in ordinary concerns, their lives punctuated by the same joys and anxieties familiar to anyone. The letters bridged the past to the present, carrying voices that had been silent for 42 years, and demanding that anyone who read them reckon with both memory and imagination. Among the contents were also small, intimate objects, a child's drawing still vibrant despite the decades, a carefully folded handkerchief, a father's watch, and other personal effects whose ordinary nature belied their emotional gravity. These items, seemingly trivial, became emotional anchors, offering glimpses of character, routine, and affection. Investigators noted the arrangement of the objects within the mailbox itself, speculating whether their placement suggested intention, concealment, or a desperate hope that someone might one day discover them. Each item invited reflection, drawing the observer into a world of private moments now intersecting with public curiosity and investigation. Emotionally, the discovery struck both investigators and relatives with a potent mix of relief, sorrow, and reverence. For those who had lived decades under the shadow of uncertainty, the mailbox's contents confirmed that the family's story had left tangible traces, even if the larger mystery of their fate remained unresolved. Relatives, handling letters and photographs with trembling hands, alternated between smiles of recognition and tears of grief. Investigators, meanwhile, approached the items not only as evidence but as reminders of the human weight behind every case file, every forensic report. The objects transformed abstraction into reality, grounding years of speculation in palpable, intimate proof. The clues also created new paths for investigation. Every item was analyzed for context, handwriting styles were compared, photographs were cross-referenced with known dates and locations, and objects were examined for hidden marks or symbols that might indicate movement or intent. Subtle details, such as a postmark on a letter, the angle of a photograph, or the presence of a personal token, suggested connections to places, people, and timelines previously unconsidered. These clues transformed a decades-old cold case into an active puzzle, reigniting professional and personal determination to piece together what had happened. Yet even as hope surged, the evidence deepened the emotional complexity of the story. The mailbox offered no simple answers, only intimations and fragments, emphasizing absence as much as presence. Each discovered object was a reminder of ordinary life stolen, moments of domestic warmth and familial routine forever suspended. Investigators and family alike were confronted with the quiet terror of realization that the family's disappearance had not erased their existence but had instead rendered their lives permanent echoes, resonant through objects and memory, but forever out of reach. Narratively, the mailbox served as both pivot and mirror. It shifted the story from abstract mystery to tangible investigation, from decades of waiting to a renewed engagement with clues that demanded interpretation. At the same time, it reflected the emotional core of the narrative, the interplay between hope and grief, memory and loss, the ordinary and the extraordinary. For the audience, this moment offered both suspense and intimacy, as every photograph, letter, and trinket spoke to the universal human experience of love, absence, and longing. In these objects, small hints began to emerge, a reference to a neighbor, a photograph that seemed out of place, a note that suggested plans interrupted. Investigators and relatives debated the significance of each, weighing the possibility of intentional concealment against the randomness of decades spent unnoticed. The ambiguity heightened the narrative tension, emphasizing that while evidence could illuminate aspects of the story, the ultimate truth remained tantalizingly elusive. Yet this very ambiguity made the human dimension of the case even more compelling. The family's lives, their ordinary joys and sorrows, had left indelible traces that demanded acknowledgement, reflection, and emotional reckoning. The mailbox's revelations thus became a bridge between past and present, memory and investigation, grief and understanding. Each item invited reflection on the enduring impact of absence, the subtle power of intimate traces, and the emotional resonance of lives interrupted. For investigators, relatives, and the town itself, the mailbox was no longer just a repository of old letters and photographs. It was a portal, offering glimpses into the private world of the missing family, and forcing all who encountered it to confront both the weight of the past and the possibility of uncovering truths that had been long buried. The discovery in the snow-covered mailbox reignited a sense of urgency that had lain dormant for decades. For investigators, what had been a cold case suddenly became alive again, the objects within the mailbox providing threads of connection that could be followed, traced, and interpreted. Teams returned to the town with renewed focus, bringing modern forensic tools and techniques that had been unavailable 42 years earlier. Fingerprints were re-examined, handwriting analyzed with digital precision, and photographs scrutinized for even the smallest discrepancies. Every detail was now a potential key, and every object was treated with the reverence of both evidence and memory. The reopening of the investigation also brought with it the emotional weight of the decades-long absence. Relatives were summoned once more, their faces etched with anticipation, hope, and fear. For some, the years had allowed a fragile acceptance to form, a rhythm of life carried alongside the ache of unanswered questions. Yet the mailbox's contents shattered any equilibrium that had been found, forcing them to confront the family's story with a new intensity. Letters, photographs, and personal items, small and ordinary in appearance, suddenly carried monumental significance. Each artifact was a reminder of life interrupted, of holidays uncelebrated, milestones missed, and the enduring human desire for closure that had been deferred for too long. As the investigation intensified, investigators began to map out connections previously overlooked. Notes hinted at trips or appointments, photographs captured fleeting interactions, and small objects suggested contact with people outside the immediate household. Each clue was carefully analyzed, but the puzzle remained complex, as if the family's final days had been a mosaic of ordinary routines, chance encounters, and subtle tensions that could only be interpreted in hindsight. The more the investigators learned, the more the emotional stakes increased, not only for the family's loved ones but also for the town that had lived under the shadow of absence for decades. For the community, the reopening of the investigation was both cathartic and unsettling. The quiet streets, once punctuated only by the rhythms of ordinary life, now resonated with the echoes of speculation, reflection, and anticipation. Neighbors revisited their own memories of that fateful Thanksgiving, recalling gestures and sightings previously dismissed as insignificant. Conversations that had once been casual now carried the weight of potential insight, as if every recollection could illuminate some hidden truth. The town itself seemed to hold its breath, caught between the ordinary march of days and the extraordinary possibility that answers were finally within reach. The emotional complexity of this renewed focus was intensified by the realization that decades of absence had not erased the family's presence. Rather, it had transformed their memory into a force that shaped perception and behavior. Relatives grappled with hope and apprehension in equal measure, fearful that the investigation might uncover truths both comforting and devastating. Investigators faced a different challenge, balancing professional detachment with the profound human resonance of the case. The mailbox, a small and seemingly mundane object, had become a focal point for these intertwined narratives, a bridge between evidence and emotion, between memory and the pressing demand for answers. As investigators delved deeper, they began to uncover patterns that had been hidden in plain sight. Letters suggested connections with neighbors and acquaintances, photographs hinted at travel beyond the immediate town, and personal items implied routines that had not been fully documented. Each piece of evidence was examined for both its forensic value and its emotional significance, creating a dual narrative that was as much about understanding human behavior as it was about reconstructing events. The challenge was immense, interpreting the ordinary minutiae of daily life in order to reconstruct a story long obscured by time, absence, and uncertainty. The renewed investigation also illuminated the town's psychological landscape. Long-standing residents confronted their own memories with fresh eyes, some experiencing guilt for what they had missed, others relief at having preserved the memory of the family with care. Conversations, once muted by caution, now became avenues for insight, as stories of fleeting interactions, small favors, and seemingly trivial exchanges were revisited. The town, collectively, became a participant in the reconstruction of history, its memory intertwined with both evidence and emotion, reflecting the way in which absence reverberates through community consciousness. Emotionally, the reopening of the investigation was exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure. Relatives experienced waves of hope, grief, and disbelief as new leads emerged, some plausible, others dead ends. Investigators moved cautiously, aware that every revelation carried profound consequences not only for the case but for the people involved. The juxtaposition of decades-old absence with sudden, tangible evidence created a tension that was almost unbearable. The past and present collided, and the emotional resonance of ordinary objects, letters, photographs, trinkets, became a conduit for both memory and truth. The narrative stakes were further heightened by the awareness that answers, if found, would inevitably reshape collective memory. The family's disappearance had defined not only the lives of relatives but also the identity of the town itself, and any revelation would confront long-held assumptions, fears, and hopes. Every discovery within the mailbox, every connection traced from the objects, and every reconstructed timeline carried the weight of emotional consequence. The case was no longer simply about finding what had been lost. It was about reconciling the past with the present, confronting decades of absence, and coming to terms with the way in which ordinary lives, abruptly interrupted, leave indelible marks on those who remain. By the end of this phase, the investigation had become both an analytical and emotional endeavor. For the family's loved ones, each new detail provided a fragile sense of progress, a tentative bridge across the void of years. For the town, the renewed scrutiny forced a confrontation with its own history, its collective memory shaped by absence and speculation. And for the investigators, the case was a reminder that even the smallest, most ordinary object can carry extraordinary significance. A mailbox in snow, a photograph, a letter, becoming a catalyst for revelation,